So you want to run a gaming company, something like PUBG or Fortnite or any of the Battle Royale games that basically defined the last decade of online gaming. Millions of players, all logging in for free, dropping onto an island, fighting to be the last one standing. No box price, no subscription fee, and yet these companies are worth billions of dollars. Sounds like the easiest business model ever invented. Build a game once, let millions of people play it for nothing, and somehow still get rich. You picture a small team of developers, a launch trailer, a viral moment on Twitch, and then the money just kind of shows up, endlessly, forever. Here's the catch. Free to play doesn't mean free to run. It means the entire cost of building, hosting, updating, and defending a game with 100 million players falls entirely on you, while the players themselves owe you nothing unless you can convince them to buy something they don't technically need. A skin, a battle pass, a weapon skin that makes zero difference to how the gun actually shoots. That's the whole business. And it's a genuinely brutal one because you're not selling a product anymore. You're selling a feeling over and over again to the same people, forever, or the company dies. Let's start with what it actually costs to build one of these games in the first place. A modern battle royale isn't some small indie project. You need a 100-player map rendered in real time with physics, weather, vehicles, and destructible environments, all running smoothly enough that someone with a 5-year-old laptop and someone with a $4,000 gaming rig can compete on roughly equal footing. Building that engine, or licensing and heavily modifying one, takes a team of hundreds of engineers, artists, and designers working for years before the game even launches. PUBG itself was built off of a modified version of an existing engine, and even with that head start, development still ran into the tens of millions of dollars before a single copy sold. And that's before you've built a single map, because maps in these games aren't cheap either. A well-designed battle royale map can take a dedicated team over a year to build, balance, and test, and most successful games end up needing several of them just to keep the game feeling fresh. Now here's where people get the economics backwards. They assume the expensive part is the game itself, the code, the art, the maps. It's not, or at least it's not the part that ends up mattering most over the life of the game. The expensive part, the part that never stops, is keeping the game alive after launch. This is where free-to-play games are a completely different animal from a traditional box-priced game. A studio that makes a single-player game can ship it, patch a few bugs, and move on. A live-service multiplayer game has to keep running, keep updating, keep fighting cheaters, and keep giving players a reason to log back in tomorrow. For years, sometimes a decade or more. Servers alone are a genuinely staggering cost at this scale. A game with tens of millions of concurrent players worldwide needs data centers spread across multiple continents because latency matters enormously in a competitive shooter. A player in Southeast Asia connecting to a server in North America is going to have a noticeably worse experience than someone playing on local infrastructure, and in a game built around split-second decisions, that lag is the difference between winning a gunfight and getting eliminated in the first 2 minutes. Running that kind of global server infrastructure with enough headroom to handle massive spikes when a new update drops or a content creator goes viral playing your game can cost tens of millions of dollars a year for a game at PUBG's scale, and that number climbs even higher during a new season launch when everyone logs in at once. Studios have to provision for the absolute worst-case traffic day, not the average day, which means a huge chunk of that server capacity is sitting mostly idle on a normal Tuesday, just so it's there and ready the one weekend a year when the whole player base decides to log in simultaneously to check out the new map. Then there's anti-cheat, and this is a cost category most players never think about, but that eats an enormous amount of engineering resources. Any game this popular becomes an immediate target for cheat developers selling aimbots and wall hacks, and it's a genuine arms race. The moment you patch one exploit, someone's already selling the next one on a Discord server, often within hours of a patch going live. Studios end up running entire dedicated teams whose only job is detecting and banning cheaters, licensing third-party anti-cheat software, and in some cases pursuing actual legal action against the companies selling cheats, which sounds dramatic but has become a real and recurring cost line for these studios. And here's the thing, cheating isn't just a moral problem, it's a retention problem. Players who keep running into cheaters stop playing. So every dollar spent on anti-cheat is really a dollar spent protecting the player base you already have. Let's talk about how these games actually make money, because this is where the whole thing gets interesting and honestly where a lot of players get a little uncomfortable once they understand exactly how it works. The core mechanic is what's called the free-to-play funnel, and it's built on a simple, slightly uncomfortable truth. The vast majority of players will never spend a single dollar. Industry estimates generally put the number of paying players in a free-to-play game somewhere between 2 and 5% of the total player base. That means if you have 100 million people playing your game, you might only have 2 to 5 million of them ever opening their wallet at all. So how do you build a billion-dollar business on 2 to 5% of your users? You make that small percentage spend a lot, and you make it as frictionless as possible for them to keep doing it, ideally without them even noticing how much they've spent in total over the course of a year. This is where battle passes come in, a seasonal purchase, usually somewhere around $10, that gives players a track of rewards to unlock as they play. It's genius, honestly, because it turns a single $10 purchase into weeks of daily engagement, since players who bought the pass are now motivated to log in every day to make sure they don't waste the money they already spent. Cosmetic skins work on a similar psychological hook, but with even higher margins, because a skin costs the studio almost nothing to produce once the 3D model exists. It's pure art and animation work, reused infinitely across millions of players with zero marginal cost per sale. Sell a skin for $20 to 1 million players, and you've made $20 million off of something that, once built, cost the company nothing additional to deliver. This is where the concept of whales becomes central to understanding the entire business model. A whale, in gaming industry language, is a player who spends dramatically more than average, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of dollars a year on a single free game. And the uncomfortable reality is that a small number of whales often generate a disproportionate share of total revenue. Some studies of free-to-play economics have found that the top 1% of paying users can account for something like half of all in-game revenue, which means the entire financial health of a game with 100 million players can genuinely hinge on keeping a few thousand extremely high-spending accounts happy and engaged. It's worth sitting with how strange that actually is for a second. A studio might have 100 million registered accounts, a few million people who've ever spent anything at all, and within that group, a few thousand accounts that matter more to the bottom line than the other 99 million combined. That's not a typo-level exaggeration either. It's roughly how the math shakes out once you follow the percentages through, which is why customer support teams at these studios often have entire tiers dedicated specifically to high-value accounts with faster response times, direct lines to community managers, and sometimes even personalized outreach when a big spender's account shows signs of going quiet. Losing one of these accounts isn't like losing one customer at a normal retail business. It can be closer to losing a small business's worth of annual revenue in a single churned player. This changes how these companies design their games in ways that aren't always obvious to a casual player. Battle passes are structured with escalating rewards specifically to create a sense of, I've already invested this much, I might as well keep going. Limited-time cosmetics create artificial scarcity. Buy it now or it's gone, maybe forever, maybe until some vague future re-release. And the psychological research behind loot boxes and randomized reward systems is genuinely close to what you'd find in the design of a slot machine, which is exactly why several countries have started regulating or outright banning loot box mechanics in games marketed to younger audiences. A regulatory risk that's become a real line item on the risk disclosures of publicly traded gaming companies. Let's talk about platform fees, because this is a cost almost nobody outside the industry thinks about, and it's a big one. If your game is on Steam or the PlayStation Store or the App Store or Google Play, the platform typically takes 30% of every transaction. 30%. That's before taxes, before payment processing fees, before anything else. So of that $20 skin, $6 is gone before the studio even sees it. This is exactly why some of the biggest games in the industry have pushed so hard to build their own launchers and direct payment systems. Cutting out that 30% cut on a game generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year in cosmetic sales is worth an enormous amount of engineering investment to avoid. Esports is another piece of this puzzle, and it's a genuinely strange one financially, because for most games, competitive esports scenes lose money directly. Prize pools, event production, broadcast talent, travel, and logistics for teams, all of it costs real money, and ticket and sponsorship revenue rarely covers it outright. So why do studios keep funding it? Because a thriving esports scene is one of the most effective marketing tools available. Watching a professional player pull off an insane clutch play in your game is free advertising that money genuinely can't buy the same way. It's authentic, it's exciting, and it drives both new player acquisition and, more importantly, keeps your existing hardcore player base emotionally invested in the game for years. Esports isn't really a separate business. It's marketing spend wearing a competitive gaming costume. Now, player acquisition cost, because getting someone to even download your free game isn't actually free either. Mobile game advertising in particular has become brutally expensive, with the cost to acquire a single new paying user sometimes running into the tens of dollars depending on the genre and region, and that's before you know whether that player will ever spend a cent. Studios run constant advertising campaigns, sponsor streamers and content creators, and increasingly pay for in-app purchases of starter packs, specifically because a new player converting into a paying player within their first week is a strong predictor of whether they'll ever become a long-term paying customer at all. There's also the mobile side of this business, which for a game like PUBG turned into basically a second company running in parallel. PUBG Mobile isn't just the same game shrunk down to fit a phone screen. Building a version that runs smoothly on a 5-year-old Android device with a fraction of a gaming PC's processing power is its own massive engineering project, often handled by an entirely separate studio with its own budget, its own live ops team, and its own monetization strategy tuned specifically for mobile spending habits, which tend to skew towards smaller, more frequent purchases rather than the occasional big-ticket cosmetic PC players go for. And then there's localization, translating the game, its marketing, its in-game text and voice lines into dozens of languages. Adjusting content for different regional regulations. China in particular has extremely specific rules about what a game can and can't show. And running region-specific servers because a player in India and a player in Brazil are going to have wildly different connectivity and different spending power, which means pricing itself often has to be adjusted market by market just to make the game accessible without leaving money on the table in wealthier regions. There's a whole community-facing side of this business too, and it's bigger than a lot of people assume. Running social media accounts, moderating official Discord servers with millions of members, translating patch notes into a dozen languages, responding to bug reports, managing the inevitable backlash when a balance change annoys a big chunk of the player base. All of that requires a genuine standing team, not a couple of interns. And on top of internal community management, studios spend heavily on paying streamers and content creators directly, either through official partner programs, sponsored tournaments, or straight-up payments to feature the game during a big update. It's a different flavor of the same logic behind esports spending. You're not paying for a guaranteed sale. You're paying to stay in front of an audience that would otherwise scroll past you for whatever's trending that week. Let's talk about what goes wrong, because this business is genuinely volatile in a way a lot of people don't appreciate. Battle Royale games in particular live and die by player count, and player count in this genre is brutally, unforgivingly competitive. When Fortnite exploded in popularity, it didn't just add new players to the genre. It pulled players directly away from PUBG and other competitors because there's a real limit to how many hours a day a person is going to spend playing Battle Royale games. And once someone commits their social circle, their cosmetics, their battle pass progress to one game, switching to another means starting over. This is why player count charts for these games often show a huge initial spike, followed by a slow, sometimes brutal decline as the next hot thing comes along and pulls the crowd elsewhere. There's a real case study worth looking at here. PUBG itself, despite basically inventing the modern battle royale genre and selling tens of millions of copies in its first year, saw its player base decline sharply once Fortnite, free, more polished, running on a more forgiving engine, entered the same space. PUBG Corp actually sued Epic Games over it, alleging Fortnite copied core gameplay elements, though the case was eventually dropped. What that lawsuit really reveals is how existential this competition actually is. This isn't like two restaurants competing for the same city block. It's a genuinely zero-sum fight for a limited pool of player attention and player wallets, and losing that fight can turn a billion-dollar company into an afterthought within a couple of years. PUBG survived mostly by leaning hard into the mobile version in markets where Fortnite never quite got the same foothold, but plenty of other Battle Royale games that launched in that same window never recovered from losing that early momentum, and most of them aren't around anymore in any form worth mentioning. There's another cost that rarely gets talked about: engine licensing fees. A lot of these games are built on third-party engines rather than fully custom in-house tech, and using a commercial engine usually means paying either a flat licensing fee or a small royalty on revenue back to the engine maker, which sounds minor until you're generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And that small royalty percentage turns into a genuinely significant line item on the annual budget. Studios that eventually build their own proprietary engines are often doing it specifically to escape that ongoing royalty, even though building and maintaining an in-house engine is its own massive, multi-year investment that only pays off once you're operating at a big enough scale. Then there's the collaborations. The crossover events where a Battle Royale game partners with a movie franchise, a music artist, or another game entirely to bring in themed skins and limited-time modes. These deals look like pure marketing wins from the outside, and they usually do drive a real spike in both new players and spending. But licensing a major brand isn't cheap. Depending on how big the partner is, these deals can involve 7- or 8-figure licensing fees paid up front, revenue-sharing arrangements on anything sold during the event, and a dedicated development sprint to actually build the crossover content, all under a tight deadline tied to whatever external event the collaboration is timed around, whether that's a movie release or an artist's tour. If the crossover doesn't land the way the marketing team hoped, that's a genuinely expensive miss. And this isn't hypothetical. The gaming industry went through a genuinely brutal wave of layoffs over the past few years, with tens of thousands of jobs cut across major studios and publishers, including companies behind some of the biggest live service games in the world. A lot of that came down to exactly this dynamic. Studios had scaled up massively during a period of booming player numbers and spending, hiring huge teams to churn out content fast enough to keep pace. And when growth slowed or a competitor ate into the player base, the cost structure that made sense at peak popularity suddenly didn't make sense anymore. Running a live service game means your headcount is basically tied to an ongoing content treadmill. You can't just stop making new maps, new skins, new events, because the moment you slow down, players notice, engagement drops, and spending drops right along with it. So when revenue softens, studios are stuck between two bad options: keep spending at the same pace and eat the margin hit, or cut staff and risk the content slowdown that tanks player retention even further. Over the past few years, with tens of thousands of jobs cut across major studios and publishers, including companies behind some of the biggest live service games in the world. A lot of that came down to exactly this dynamic. Studios had scaled up massively during a period of booming player numbers and spending, hiring huge teams to churn out content fast enough to keep pace. And when growth slowed or a competitor ate into the player base, the cost structure that made sense at peak popularity suddenly didn't make sense anymore. Running a live service game means your headcount is basically tied to an ongoing content treadmill. You can't just stop making new maps, new skins, new events, because the moment you slow down, players notice, engagement drops, and spending drops right along with it. So when revenue softens, studios are stuck between two bad options: keep spending at the same pace and eat the margin hit, or cut staff and risk the content slowdown that tanks player retention even further. Over the past few years, with tens of thousands of jobs cut across major studios and publishers, including companies behind some of the biggest live service games in the world, a lot of that came down to exactly this dynamic. Studios had scaled up massively during a period of booming player numbers and spending, hiring huge teams to churn out content fast enough to keep pace. And when growth slowed or a competitor ate into the player base, the cost structure that made sense at peak popularity suddenly didn't make sense anymore. Running a live service game means your headcount is basically tied to an ongoing content treadmill. You can't just stop making new maps, new skins, new events, because the moment you slow down, players notice, engagement drops, and spending drops right along with it. So when revenue softens, studios are stuck between two bad options: keep spending at the same pace and eat the margin hit, or cut staff and risk the content slowdown that tanks player retention even further. So how does a game like this actually make money in plain mechanical terms? Total revenue from battle passes, cosmetics, and any other in-game purchases, minus the platform's cut, minus server and infrastructure costs, minus anti-cheat and live ops staffing, minus marketing and player acquisition spend, minus the ongoing cost of the development team producing new content every single season. If a game generates $200 million a year in gross revenue, loses $60 million to platform fees, spends $50 million on servers and live operations, $20 million on anti-cheat and content moderation, and another $40 million on marketing and acquisition, you're left with maybe $30 million in actual profit. A real number, but a much thinner margin than the eye-popping revenue headline suggests. And here's the volatility on top of that math. Player count isn't stable. It swings hard based on what competitors are doing, what content creators are playing that month, and whether your last big update landed well or flopped. A bad season, one where the new content doesn't land, or a competitor launches something genuinely fresh, can tank both player count and spending simultaneously. And because so much of your revenue comes from a small number of highly engaged whales, losing even a modest percentage of that top spending group can crater your quarterly numbers, even while your total download count looks completely fine on paper. It's a genuinely uncomfortable position to be in as a business, because the metric everyone outside the company looks at, total players, total downloads, can be completely disconnected from the metric that actually determines whether the studio makes payroll that quarter. Let's put together the two versions of a year for a game like this. In a strong year, the seasonal content lands well. A couple of collaborations with popular franchises bring in new players and drive a spike in cosmetic purchases. Esports viewership grows, and the whale segment stays engaged and spending. Word of mouth does a lot of the marketing team's job for them. Streamers pick up the new season organically without needing to be paid for it, and the game climbs the trending charts on its own momentum. Under those conditions, a mid-sized live service game can genuinely pull in profit margins in the 20 to 30% range, which is an extraordinary business by almost any standard. In a rough year, A major competitor launches something that pulls player attention away. A content season underperforms. Server costs climb because of an unexpected traffic spike from a failed anti-cheat rollout that let bots flood the game, and a chunk of your highest-spending players quietly drift to whatever's trending that month. Under those conditions, that same studio can slide from a healthy profit into a loss, while the game itself still has millions of daily active users and still looks, from the outside, like a massive success. The gap between those 2 years can be enormous, tens of millions of dollars, sometimes more, and almost none of it shows up as one dramatic headline. It's a season that didn't quite land, a competitor's update that stole the spotlight for a few weeks, a slow bleed of whale spending that nobody notices until the quarterly numbers come in. Meanwhile, the game still has a massive Discord, still trends on Twitch, still looks completely healthy to anyone scrolling through the player count on a Tuesday night. The queue times are still fast, the new season trailer still gets millions of views. Streamers are still playing it every night. None of that tells you anything about whether the company behind it is actually making money that quarter. Because the two things, how alive a game looks from the outside and how healthy its finances actually are, can drift apart for a surprisingly long time before anyone outside the studio notices. So if you ever find yourself dreaming about running a gaming company like this, remember the one thing that actually decides whether you survive. It was never really about how many people download your game for free. It's about whether you can keep convincing a tiny sliver of your total audience to keep paying you season after season before they get bored and move on to whatever comes next.